Hi everybody and welcome back to Political Philosophy, Spring 2020 for Lehman College. So in the first half of the semester, we focused on the classical liberal tradition in the West. And for the rest of the semester, we'll take that core of understanding about classical liberalism in the West and bring it up to contemporary society. And in that way, John Dewey will work as a bridge because he talks about how all of our philosophical concepts that came down to us from Locke and Rousseau and all the other people that we've looked at and have changed to fit into contemporary capitalist society. Okay, so first some background. John Dewey was born in 1859 and he died in 1952. He was a philosopher in the tradition called pragmatism, which is a uniquely American school of philosophy that also includes William James and Charles Peirce. He was also a very famous public intellectual of his day and wrote a lot for popular magazines and newspapers. Pragmatism is a school of philosophy that emphasizes usefulness. Instead of having theories that are abstract and apart from daily life, pragmatists in general, and it's a really complex subfield of philosophy, but in general, pragmatists think that a theory's value is only measured in what it can actually do for everyday life. And not even necessarily just philosophical theory. If you're a pragmatist about everything, that goes the same for human theory of all kinds, including aesthetic, scientific, mathematical, psychological. Theories only have value when they can do something for us, or we can do something with them. So when he uses a word like democracy, he has a very specific definition in mind. It isn't just a system of representative politicians that we vote for, majority rules. He envisioned it as something that is an entire way of life, that we will get to our highest level of human flourishing, both societally and individually, if we incorporate the ideals of democracy into our everyday lives. Hopefully, what he meant by that will become a little bit clearer as we look further into this article that we're reading for today called Liberalism and Social Action. And it's a very different understanding of what it means to be an individual in a political world than anything we've looked at so far. Because if you think about Locke, if you think about Hume, if you think about Rousseau, they all started from a place where they took the idea of an individual self operating in society as a given. They didn't investigate it any further. Okay, so this is what I mean by Dewey being a bridge for us from classical liberalism to modern political liberal theory. He goes deeply into a history of Western political democratic theory and all of the economic and social forces that shaped it as time unfolded. So as we talk about this, there are a couple important concepts that I want to remind you of to keep in mind. Utilitarianism, and that is the school of thought that political and social action needs to be judged on its consequences. The greater the utility, the better the action, morally, psychologically, in whatever human field you're looking at. And to understand how utilitarianism is important to the history of liberalism in the West, we'll look at Jeremy Bentham and we'll look back at John Stuart Mill. Another important thing to keep in mind is the classical conception of economics and what it should do, coming down to us from Adam Smith. Another influence on modern liberalism, Dewey argues, is the Romantic movement. of the mid to late 1800s up to the beginning of the 20th century, and the emergence of modern capitalism. So we're going to hopefully touch on all of those themes and see how they weave together to create the conception of liberalism that we're probably more familiar with, in contrast to the classical liberal ideal of the government only having legitimacy when it is protecting us from harm and it is enlarging our negative human rights. So this is copyrighted in 1935. It was published a little bit later, and it began its life as a series of public lectures. We're only going to read the first lecture. There are two more. But the ultimate conclusion, in case you're curious, that Dewey works toward is to fight for a new conception of liberalism that's not just utilitarian or economic, and instead one that uses social action to improve the lives of individuals and society itself through a constant attitude of experimentation. So he doesn't think that any ideology, whether it be democracy or socialism, should be considered as the ultimate knowledge of how we should organize society. But instead, we need to be more reactive to political conditions, environmental conditions, educational conditions, and constantly experiment with how to tweak and improve our political machinery, as well as the machinery of our everyday lives. I said this one already. We're only going to focus on the first lecture. So it gives us this story throughout history, from Locke all the way up until now, or at least now in the 1930s when he was writing. And it's pages 1 to 27 in the book, not the PDF, because there are 2 pages per page on the PDF. So let's think about what was going on in America in 1935. What sort of political, social, and economic pressures people were feeling. Of course, they were right in the midst of the Depression. They were still dealing with the aftermath of World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic. And there was an upswell of support for socialism at that time. Things are pretty chaotic. So Dewey wonders if any form of liberalism can be of value to the world. Remember, he's a pragmatist. He wants theory that is valuable to people. Okay, so on page 3, he says the way to best figure out if liberalism has any value to the modern world is to trace it. Trace its roots, to see where we got this intellectual tradition from and what we can salvage from it. He says on page 3, the natural beginning of the inquiry in which we are engaged is the consideration of the origin and past development of liberalism. And he acknowledges that we could go all the way back to the Greeks if we wanted to, but it's not really necessary to, because our intellectual and historical tradition stems strongly from Locke. He's kind of like a founding father of the type of liberalism that's relevant to modern society. Okay, so Dewey gives us an interpretation of Locke, and I want you to ask yourself if the way he interprets Locke matches how we studied Locke. And here I have a long quote from page 4 in the book. I'll read it to you now. The outstanding points of Locke's version of liberalism are that governments are instituted to protect the rights that belong to individuals prior to political organization of social relations. So recall that Locke based his entire concept of how governments have legitimate power and where they're not legitimate by saying that we have natural human rights. For him, of course, they were God-given, but we can look at it as a natural order. Rights are fundamental in this conception. And Dewey goes on to say, these rights are those summed up a century later in the American Declaration of Independence, the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Among the natural rights especially emphasized by Locke is that of property, originating according to him in the fact that an individual has mixed himself through his labor with some natural hitherto unappropriated object. So remember, that was Locke's ultimate foundation or justification for property rights. Once you go out and you use your own body or your mind to create something that wasn't there before, you now own that mixed object. So historically now, Dewey's going to say, continuing with the quote, this view is directed against levies on property made by rulers without authorization from the representatives of the people. So this is monarchs and the gentry, the rich, the wealthy, the powerful, just taking from other people what they wanted. And then Dewey goes on to say, and this is Locke, Locke's theory culminated in justifying the right of revolution. Since governments are instituted to protect their natural rights of individuals, they lose claim to obedience when they invade and destroy these rights instead of safeguarding them. A doctrine which well served the aims of our forefathers in the revolt against British rule, and that also found an extended application in the French Revolution of 1789. So you could find that long quote on page 4, and I think it pretty well matches the way that we looked at Locke. But then Dewey goes on to note that this rights conception of political legitimacy is incredibly individualistic. Again, it assumes what an individual is, and it assumes that they're the fundamental unit of political and social action without arguing for it. They just say it's natural. But what does this mean, that a conception of political legitimacy is individualistic? I have 2 images here from verywellmind.com, who, while it doesn't perfectly translate, hopefully will give you a little bit of an idea of the different kinds of values that you could theoretically have for society, or even for yourself. If you live in a collectivistic culture, the norm, instead of being individual rights, is going to be thinking about what promotes the wellness or well-being of the entire group. So you have a list here. Your social rules, pressures, and morals and values promote selflessness, going out and helping others. Working as a group is more basic or common or traditional than working on your own. Doing what's best for everybody and sacrificing your own personal needs. And this is the key one that's going to be the most relevant for our purposes at the bottom. Families and communities have a central role. So now, instead of thinking about individual person, their wants and needs and desires, we think about the relationships that people have as basic. Whereas if you move on over to the traits of individualistic cultures, the values that are going to be more likely promoted are things like independence, self-sufficiency, autonomy. You can get stuff done without help from other people. And the only relationships that matter are the fact that they're not infringing upon your rights. I should say matter politically. Okay. So remember that one of the big questions I asked you in the first half of the semester was to think about how different theories either put up the individual as the basic unit or the state as the thing that's most important. We concluded that Rousseau put the state first, even though there was this little wrinkle of the state only matters when it cares about the general will. Locke, of course, puts the individual as the unit of primary social importance. And Mill recognizes public utility, but he still places strong restrictions on governmental action. Remember, he's the one that came up with the harm principle, saying that if something doesn't violate the harm principle, the government has no right legislating on it. So that is strongly in favor of individualistic liberty. Hume is sort of the odd one out. He speaks of government as the engine of promoting a certain type of virtue, and I think people have interpreted him both in an individualistic way and a collectivist way. So you might call that something like a hybrid theory, but Dewey specifically is something I'm going to call hybrid theory. He doesn't think that we can flourish as people if we are separated from the social and political environments that we're shaped in. So, of course, we're individuals in the sense that we have our own bodies, our own minds, our own lives. But he doesn't think we become fully individual or fully realized, that we can't reach our maximum potential as people or as a society unless we have strong social institutions. So if you've ever taken a psychology class, you might have seen the little pyramid on the right. That's Abraham Maslow's motivation model. And he says we need the ones at the bottom to be fulfilled before we can ever start to care about the goals of the top. So you look down at the very bottom and it says physiological needs. So that's safety, shelter, food, water, and air. Well, there's safety right above that. And then he thought we also need to belong into some social group. We need esteem. We need to think of ourselves as capable. And then above that is where we can grow once we have those basic needs met. On the left here, there's an updated model from some psychologists from Psychology Today. And they say, okay, we have subsistence at the bottom, but then the social is actually part of this bedrock right after we get our absolute basic need to survive kind of stuff out of the way. And this is more akin to what Dewey is arguing for. Yes, again, of course, we have our own bodies and our own lives, but the social is so integrated into our well-being that we need to have strong social ties if we really want to reach our highest potential. And I'm going to stop there for this particular lecture. I will begin again in Dewey Part 2.